Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Great. Welcome to the town hall on COVID-19 relief. We have today, and thank you everyone for joining us on Facebook, on Zoom, on live stream, YouTube, wherever you are. Really appreciate you being here. And thank you so much for my panelists who are here. I'm really excited for this really important conversation that we'll be having today. So today we have with us Sue Altman, State Director of New Jersey Working Families Party. We have Dr. Patricia Campos Medina, who is a labor and political activist, as well as Beverly Brown Ruggia, who is the financial justice organizer for New Jersey Citizen Action. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for joining me, and thank you all for being here to share your thoughts on what COVID-19 relief should be looking like. So this is, I think, the fifth of our town halls that we're doing on the pandemic. It's been more than 2 months since we've had stay-at-home orders, since essential workers have been working throughout in fairly dangerous conditions in some ways, with hardly any PPE protections, and testing, while it's ramping up, is insufficient at all different levels. And so while in New Jersey, I think we are kind of going past the curve, and we are now thinking about how to reopen the economy in staged, planned ways while still being as safe as possible, people are hurting. This is a massive public health crisis that has affected all of us in multiple different ways, including and particularly economically. And I think it's affected poor and working class families in particular much worse. Certain vulnerable communities, Black and Brown communities, much worse than others. And what it's done, and the theme that seems to be, is it has uncovered the kinds of gaps that we already have in the system and exacerbated them. And it's really revealed the kinds of social issues and the kind of rips in the fabric of our society that we have. Part of it, 2 months ago, Congress started with relief packages. We talk about mutual aid. We talk about local, state, and federal relief quite a bit. And this started even in our communities with mutual aid. And while it's been heartening to see how our communities come together and help each other, it's clearly not enough, right? We need a lot more than what we're getting now. And this is our fourth package with the HEROES Act that we're coming back into and talking about. And what I'd love to talk about is what's good, what has been good about the relief packages, what has been important for working families, for folks in New Jersey, but also what could be better. Because the perspective that I have coming into this is thinking about the kinds of folks who have gotten bailouts, the kinds of folks or the kinds of companies really that have been affected directly by this, seems to be emphasizing corporations over people. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And I'd love to hear, where you think the relief should be and should be moving forward. So Sue, do you want to start off with your thoughts briefly?
Yeah, sure. Of course. This is great. Thanks for having me here. So the situation in Washington is changing quickly, and obviously the difference between the House and the Senate means that we aren't sure what will happen with these various bills. One of the things about the bill that we're looking at right now is it really does have some amazing protections for individuals that are important in working families that are really important. So first is immigrants, second is college students, and other categories of folks. The piece that New Jersey is paying attention to in particular, and that's really, really important, is how much money is going to states directly and not corporations. So you can imagine that if you're a Washington congressperson, you're hearing from governors of states, you're hearing from the congressional delegations of states, but you're also hearing from corporate lobbyists. And what we saw in the first bailout, bailout's probably the wrong word, but the first package of aid to states was a lot of it went to corporations. A lot of it went directly to companies that, have little or no accountability. And we've seen that movie play out already in New Jersey. And we know that that isn't how trickle down economics doesn't work. It's never worked. So that's not something we want to see repeated in subsequent bills. So from our standpoint here in New Jersey, we want two things to happen. One is we want individuals to be taken care of. We want a second round stimulus. We want immigrants of all status to be included in the bill because they're part of our community as well. We want students to be included. We want young people. We want there to be hope to individuals in this bill. And at the same time, we also need to have aid directly to states. States need money. New Jersey alone is facing an over $10 billion budget hole, which sounds like sort of an inconceivable number. It's almost a third, if not maybe between a third and a fourth of the entire state budget. This is a massive hole. So it's really, really important that our congressional delegation is fighting for New Jersey when they go to Washington. We saw Mitch McConnell, now obviously he's a senator, but we saw Mitch McConnell the other day say something about, how it's all blue states' fault, right? Blue states need to pay attention to their own finances. It's not the federal government's responsibility. That's ridiculous. The blue states happen to be the ones that have borne the brunt of the COVID crisis so far. That will not remain to be the case. And it's certainly true that the blue states bail out the red states all the time, and we're all one country for a reason. So I think what's really important is that our congressional delegation really deliver on these things for New Jerseyans, both as the state, but also as individuals. And both of those things need to happen at the same time. And in the Senate, yeah, you're going to have to be able to cross party lines, which is really hard to do. But the House can set the tone for what could even be possible in the Senate. And so, that's what we would look for our congressional delegation. And that's what's really, really important right now here in New Jersey for people who are from working families.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that, Sue, because as an elected representative, as a local Congress member who actually just introduced the budget as a chair of finance in Glen Rock, we introduced the budget 2 weeks ago, and it's been tough, right? Yeah. We had to redo all the kinds of things that we were thinking about just a few months ago. And so understanding that there are going to be revenue shortfalls, that there are going to be issues that we need to deal with at a local level, and being able to not even understand whether we can rely on state aid because of that hole that you're talking about. I think, it affects all of us individually at an everyday basis as well when we're talking about this. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that makes it really hard to do business, and I use the word business loosely, I don't just mean like commerce, market commerce, but the business of running boards of education, the business of running, like you said, town councils. Like, we need to have certainty, and we need to know where that money's coming from and if we're going to get it. And the state feels the same way. Like, so the state has a constitutional obligation to balance the budget. The federal government does not. So they can actually dole out this money. It's not good practice over a long period of time to carry huge, huge amounts of debt. But in a crisis situation, we need to do it. And it's not even hurricane season yet. We're not even close to the end of even this year's perils, which is hard to imagine given how long 2020 has felt so far. So yeah, so we need the federal government to have our back. The states make up the federal government. It's unbelievable that we even need to say this. Like, what are we in 5th grade civics class? This federal government should be looking out for the backs of the states, because we are the meat and potatoes of how this country operates. So yeah, that's critical. It's super important because it's at the local level that a lot of these services are delivered. And that has to this year come from the federal government.
Yeah, and I agree with you in terms of the amount of aid that's necessary too, right? Because people look at these numbers and they think, as you mentioned, that these are astronomical numbers, but these are numbers that we actually need both for state and local governments as we're talking about them. And when you divide them up, with the number of states that we have, it becomes a smaller and smaller piece of the pie.
And we need money to go to individual people. I mean, I think one of the great fallacies of the last couple of decades, but certainly even the early 2000s, was this idea that okay, we're going to give corporations this unlimited amount of money, but anytime we even talk a little bit about giving people money or working families money, it's oh, we can't do that. Oh, that's a waste of money. But how do we think the economy works? The economy works when people have money in their pocket and then can go spend it at the bodega on the corner. That's how the economy works. So this idea that we have to only give corporations money when we know so much of that goes to line the pockets of CEOs, we've seen tiny versions of that at the state level, and we see ginormous versions of that at the federal level, which is why we need more progressive Congress people to nip that crap in the bud.
And I think at the end of the day, when we look at even the reports that we're seeing almost on a daily basis of billionaires getting even richer in the past 2 months of the pandemic, I think that, brings it to fore, right? And, when we talk about the famous example of Amazon, which was in the news, I think, a couple weeks ago, talking about what their profits are while they are cutting protections for essential workers, while they're not giving hazard pay or not as much as they need to, while they're getting rid of protections. And Patricia, I'd love for you to sort of comment on that in general. And, I'd love your perspective on what the relief packages have or haven't been doing.
Thank you for the invitation to be part of this discussion. I think that what Sue is alluding to and what we have been dealing with is this model of economic policy that basically for the last 40 years has drastically increased our income inequality, in which a billionaires owned 40% of the wealth of this country, and where the middle class was squeezed out during the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, in which it became very hard for middle class families to keep their homes. So many lost it, of all their wealth was in their homes, and then their students couldn't even get a job when they came out. So we sort of coming into this crisis with a middle class that doesn't have the ability to survive without direct assistance from the federal government, and with a working class who is mostly low wage pay women, single family women, immigrants, people of color who work on the gig economy. Those jobs that don't provide you permanency, don't provide you health insurance, don't provide you permanent hours. I mean, we used to say that we had a full employment, an unemployment rate of 3.5, but it was only because people were having 2-3 jobs to make one salary. And so we entered into this crisis where we have essential workers were the same, bearing the brunt of the illness, were the same ones that were struggling before the crisis. So when we look at it in the sense, then we need members of Congress, and we need a Congress people, not just in New Jersey. We need people in Congress to understand that what we need is a transformation of our economic priorities. We have been given tax breaks to millionaires for 40 years, and taking away the tax base of the federal government to be able to provide for investments like infrastructure that creates jobs, and for our schools so that the parents prepares our kids. So little by little, we took away the ability of the federal government to regulate banks, to regulate our workplaces, to the point that OSHA, the Office of Safety and Health right now, is incapable of regulating the health and safety of workers in the workplace. And so workers right now who are essential workers, who are not just doctors and nurses, and we're very grateful for their sacrifices. But when we think about essential workers, we think about the warehouse workers, the manufacturing workers, workers in the restaurants that are producing food, or the Uber drivers that are driving the food. Those workers have no protections and no ability to file a complaint with the Office of Health and Safety. And even the minimum protections that states like New Jersey has been able to establish cannot be enforced in the workplace. So when you see workers standing up and basically doing sit-ins, they do seek outs, demanding corporations do more, and they're asking for simple things. They're asking for PPE, personal protection equipment. I mean, we still have warehouse workers that they make their own masks to walk into an Amazon warehouse, or to a factory making airplanes, like Certec in Woodridge, making airplanes for the federal government. They're asking for hazard pay. If they're gonna put their lives on the line, they should be able to have something better than the minimum wage or a $2 wage increase. And they should get paid sick leave, not for 5 days that New Jersey guarantees, but the government should guarantee the 14, 15 days of quarantine pay. And they should guarantee pay sick leave if they're sick. So they're basic things that, like professionals like us, that like have professional jobs that can work at home, basically take for granted. And we think that because we have it, most workers have it, but the reality is not. having a paid sick day is a luxury for a lot of our workers, and we ought to demand more from our Congress, because Congress should be demanding that any bailout to corporations that comes out should have strings attached. And the strings attached is that they improve the working conditions of workers inside their facilities, that they pay for sick days, that they pay for healthcare somehow, and that they put back the money in our communities. Right now, none of that is happening. And it's up to us as citizens to demand that members of Congress, like the one that represents the district that you're trying to represent, stands up for a different economic model that puts people first, rather than just giving more tax breaks to Bezos, Jeff Bezos, and all the billionaires. We can name them with two hands. I mean, 8 fingers. Those are the billionaires. 8 people own 40% of American wealth, and it's unacceptable to allow that to continue.
Yeah, that is not a society that is sustainable, right? So I read today, and I'm sure we have lots and lots of these statistics about how Jeff Bezos essentially has increased his wealth by something like $35 million for each day of this pandemic crisis, and refuses to have paid sick leave for workers. So, you know, and I know that today is a day of action to ask Congress and your congressional leaders to pass the Essential Worker Bill of Rights. And I would urge everybody to do that. And that includes really sensible workplace health protections like PPE, as you're talking about, Patricia. It's insane to me that this is still not given, even as we're asked to put our masks on to go into stores. Essential worker pay for sure, and paid sick and family leave, which is, considering this is a public health crisis, it is absolutely a no-brainer at the end of the day. And expanding free healthcare. I mean, yes, I'm definitely on the record of saying that we need to move to a single payer healthcare system. But look, this is a public health crisis. And at the end of the day, what we have are sick people. We can't have sick people who are afraid of going to the doctor, who cannot afford medical bills, who are delaying healthcare because they are worried about the cost and they're worried about accessibility. And I think at the end of the day, that's, that is a very basic human right that is now more critical than ever, and it's actually for all of our safeties. So I agree with you there. So you mentioned consumer protection briefly, Patricia. You mentioned some of that, and I want to bring Beverly in to this conversation. And I'd love to hear, Beverly is financial justice organizer at New Jersey Citizen Action. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Beverly, on the relief packages, on the kinds of things that you're worried about. And I know that before we started, you had this really interesting stage model about relief, talking about emergency relief, stabilization, and relief and recovery. And I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here with everybody. Sue, Patricia, and Arati, thank you so much. So I think everybody has laid the groundwork for the kinds of things that I want to talk about. First of all, this top-down model, any top-down model, or trickle-down, I should say, model for the relief work that's being done is just not going to work. It doesn't work. It didn't work before the pandemic, and it's not going to work during the pandemic. We know that, as somebody else said, putting, keeping people's lives stable, making sure that people can feed their families, that they can get the health care they need, that they have money to spend, is what is going to keep the economy strong. And so for starters, we know that that's just not going to work. The initial CARES Act did respond, I would say, just in an emergency way. As I said, we're looking at, emergency relief, stabilization, and then a kind of a safe landing into a long-term recovery. And so the initial impulses to address housing, making sure that people weren't put out of their homes, those were all good. The attempt to expand unemployment benefits was in the right direction. But as we know, the CARES Act fell dramatically short. People didn't have enough money. I think 500,000 people in New Jersey alone were excluded from benefits because of their status, their immigrant status. And so it fell far short. I think that the HEROES Act goes a long way. As Sue said, it has some really strong provisions in it. From the consumer finance protection perspective, it definitely expands a number of the issues that we're concerned about, or expands protections in the areas that we're concerned about. And so, you know, when we think about a society where you have dramatic income inequality, people don't have job security, you know, that is a recipe for economic failure. And so we have an environment where we are a debt society. People just owe much more money than they earn. They can't afford their housing. And so, you know, when you one of the biggest examples is, you know, a nation that prides itself on education, you know, we owe about $1.6 trillion. We have about $1.6 trillion in student debt, people who are trying to get an education, trying to better themselves, trying to improve their you know, workplace abilities to get good jobs. And so, you know, that's a symptom right there of a system upside down. We know that low and moderate income people have an enormous credit card debt. They have to, you know, they're taking out payday loans. They're taking out they're availing themselves of all kinds of unhealthy lending products because they don't make enough money. So the environment that we were in before the crisis was toxic. And now we have people, I think what is it, 20, did it hit 25? I don't know, I think it was 25 million people unemployed. In New Jersey, it's over 1 million. And so we're looking at people who were, you know, you might say on their knees, and they're now on their backs. And so for the federal government to take the approach that they're going to distribute our tax dollars through large companies, through large banks, to somehow trickle down to those people who are really, you know, struggling more than they ever have, and they were already struggling, is absurd. But I'm really glad to see a lot of the provisions in relation to consumer finance protection in the HEROES Act. For instance, they are going to expand relief they're going to improve the relief provision for forbearance for mortgages. There's an expanded provision for student loan debt. Initially, the provisions for student loan debt only covered federal loans and all loans that were held by the federal government. It will now expand to private loans. And in New Jersey, that adds up to about $9 billion worth of student debt. And so those students will see some relief if the HEROES Act is passed. We are fighting very hard on the ground here in New Jersey, not doing so well, but also on the federal level, the HEROES Act will do something about debt collection, protecting people from unnecessary debt collection. People can't pay their, you know, if you can't pay your rent, you can't pay your mortgage, you can barely feed your family, you can't be paying, you know, giant amounts payments on your loans. Student loans we often call them houseless mortgages. They're so huge. Each month people are paying out $500 to $1,500 just for a student loan. There's no way they can pay that during this period. And so I'm very glad to see that in the HEROES Act, they are addressing more specifically and a little bit more broadly debt collection. Where, you know, aside from the sort of wounded, I would say, economic situation we have, our low and moderate income people in this country normally, I guess people like to call it the normal situation. We have an administration in Washington that has been attacking consumer finance protections from day one. We had finally, you know, in the history of this country, for the first time, an institution called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was put in place specifically to protect each of us from unfair, deceptive, and abusive practices among lenders and bankers. And when this administration took office, the first thing they did was put a fox in the hen house and start tearing down all of the work, you know, stopping the work that was being done in that office to protect us from banks like, banks who were stealing our identity, student servicers who were defrauding people, for-profit colleges that were defrauding people. And so, as I said, while people are on their backs, it should be a priority. It should be among the highest priorities in any legislation that's passed to make sure that people don't have to worry about their debt and have to worry about being harassed. We want to make sure that there are protections in place from a predatory lending industry that is ready and waiting. I mean, they are licking their chops trying to get high cost loans out to low and moderate income people who do need money, who are struggling. But when you have a last person who called me about this, took out $200 loan, she will pay $1,400 back on the loan that she took out. Mind you, this is illegal in New Jersey, but you can get these loans online. So I can only imagine today when somebody's unemployment check is 2 weeks late, they are desperately trying to pay their bills. Those easy, quick loans that you can get online are going to be very attractive. And so we at Citizen Action are urging the entire Congress to pass a national rate cap, 36% rate cap. 36% is still high, and our rate cap in New Jersey is 30%. But when you're talking about an industry across the country that has an average rate of 400% on these small dollar loans, and we are talking about small dollar loans, and so they are targeting the most vulnerable people in the country who have the least amount of money. And so we also hope that Congress will be leery of those things going on, the kind of predatory practices that happen in an economic downturn where people, as I said, are on their backs. But I am hopeful. The HEROES Act does have a lot of really good provisions. It's going to, it would make a huge difference. And I think, as all of you said, it's important, although the majority of the New Jersey delegation is definitely in support of the HEROES Act, we need to make a lot of noise. We need to be supporting them, giving them ammunition. We need to be telling our legislators our stories. The more they know about our individual experiences and what's going on in our homes and the way we can't manage our finances, the better they're able to articulate that and fight for the kinds of protections we need at the federal level. So I encourage everybody who's listening to make calls every day. Call people who don't represent you. There's a guy named Mitch McConnell who probably needs to be hear some things, be educated about what's going on in people's real lives. I've asked Rada to make sure you all have my email address. I'm happy to take stories and make sure that they are heard by legislators across the country to make sure that you get the kind of protections. I think, I work in an area that can be a little bit boring in terms of, nobody likes to really talk about loans and APR, and it's really awful. But unfortunately, we live in a world where even those of us who make very little money often have to take out loans, and we find ourselves with debt. And certainly anybody who's trying to get educated, student debt is only second to mortgage debt in this country. And it's a tremendous burden on us, on the individual. And it's really a burden on our society that we're going to pay for in the long run in terms of our economy and in terms of having a weaker workforce. So that's a little bit of the picture that we're thinking about in terms of consumer finance protections at Citizen Action, and really asking people to send us stories so that we can get your information to the people who are decision makers and lawmakers.
Yeah, and for those, I know that we have folks out there listening. In fact, actually, we have a couple of questions related to student debt that came through that I think we're going to put on here. But for everyone who's out there who is thinking about these things, please do send them in. I think that's really important. With the point that you were making, Beverly, and that all of you have been making about making sure that we are helping individuals and helping people. We've had this one-time payment of $1,200. I know several people who still haven't seen it in their accounts. And the difference between that and being able to count on a cash payment on a monthly basis, which is what I would be advocating for, is, I think, perhaps the difference between being able to plan or being able to afford things and not being able to take out some of those loans that you're talking about, the small dollar loans, Beverly. Being able to count on something like this coming down, I think, is helpful. And the fact that we're not doing that, that it seems to be a non-starter at this point is incredibly disheartening.
It's especially disheartening since we can open up the Treasury when we need to do billions of dollars of tax breaks for the ultimate, the richest people in this country. At the drop of a dime, we can provide money beyond what the Pentagon asks for. Billions of dollars are set aside in I think it's called the emergency fund or something that goes beyond the massive Pentagon budget. And so, we can turn on a dime to do those things. When people are sick, when people don't have their jobs, in the millions, We need to be able to open up that treasury and make sure that everybody is safe and stable until we get through this, until we get back on our feet, until small businesses are reopened, and until people get their jobs back. That's what we need to do. It's our tax money, and they need to give it to us right now.
And I want to bring up a point, because it is our tax money, and we pay it into the funds that go into the federal government, and we don't get it all back. But there's a group of people in New Jersey and around this country that didn't get $1,200, even though they were working and paying taxes. And those are immigrants, are undocumented immigrant workers, that many of them do pay taxes if they through their ITIN, their tax ID, which the IRS provides it for them to pay into the payroll, into unemployment insurance, into Medicare, and Social Security. So those workers are basically left out on their own, and they just in New Jersey alone, it's almost 500,000 people who are paying taxes and working and have no relief. They did not get $200, and their kids, they're U.S.-born children. Over 125,000 U.S.-born children of undocumented parents who basically have no relief and have to depend on mutual aid and social aid and the work that we do in the immigrant rights community to keep them surviving. So when we talk about relief and relief for all, recovery for all, we also need to remind members of Congress that immigrants are part of our communities and that they also deserve recovery assistance. If we don't keep them safe, we are not safe ourselves, because they live with us. New Jersey is the third largest recipient of immigrants from around the world. And for any, I mean, we have New York, and New York is the number one. And for this region not to leave out our immigrant communities and undocumented immigrants communities, it's just irresponsible. It's just irresponsible to think that we're going to contain the spread or keep our communities healthy, our schools healthy, if we do not provide assistance to families of immigrant workers to stay, to sustain them through the crisis.
No, I agree completely, because helping our most vulnerable folks, helping our undocumented folks, helping essential workers is actually strengthening our safety. It is a public health issue at the end of the day. And it is, in addition to the value that we bring. So we have a question on here. So from there, so Ethan in Glen Rock is asking, how will relief bills affect college students who have been missing out on relief money? So I don't know if that's something that any of you want to talk about, especially for folks who have student loan debt.
Well, if they have student loans, they will be eligible for, on the federal level, the provisions that are in place to suspend payments, but there won't be, the relief bill doesn't provide any special direct money to students who aren't eligible for other relief. But if they have a loan, a federal loan, the CARES Act covers them. In New Jersey, there are some other provisions for students with loans that the governor negotiated with private bank for private loans. Mm-hmm. And also if you have something called an NJ class loan that's given out through the state, but it wouldn't put direct money in their hands. I do know that there's also the legislature passed a bill that would exempt the spring semester of 2020 from the maximum that somebody is able to get for state assistance for school. So for instance, if there's an immigrant student who is in school who has financial aid, this semester would not count towards their cap, but that's not direct aid or cash or anything that goes into their pockets. It's kind of a long-term help for them. So we're still at the same place in terms of making sure that everyone gets some kind of immediate cash release. What's there for students isn't going to provide that. Mm-hmm. It's one less worry in terms of bills to pay each month, but it's not going to help with basic, living expenses.
So is it an automatic, forbearance, or do folks have to make sure that they reach out to their lenders and say, hey, we can't pay, or how does that work?
For the federal student loans, and keep in mind, there are some federal student loans that are not owned by the by the federal government. They're managed by private, by commercial institutions. Those are not covered. But if you have a federal loan that is covered in the CARES Act, that's the majority of the student loans for higher education in the country. If you have that, there's supposed to be an automatic. If you have automatic payments, those are supposed to stop. Now, we have reports that that's still happening, and people should be looking to make sure that they've stopped, and they should contact their servicers in the Department of Education to make sure that has stopped. Unfortunately, another provision in the CARES Act is that no wages may be garnished for student debt. So if you were behind, they should not be garnishing your wages for that. If they are, you should contact me. I can also get you the information. There's the Student Borrower Protection Center and the National Consumer Law Center are suing the Department of Education and Betsy DeVos for not making sure that wages are the garnishment is suspended for 6 months through September 30th. And so if you have a story, if your wages are being garnished, or there's some kind of bad credit reporting related to your student debt, you contact me. If we can get your story to these organizations that are filing these various suits, there's another one about credit reporting that will help the case and ultimately get your money restored to you, and also help clean up your credit if it's been, if there's been negative credit reporting in violation of the CARES Act. So you do have to be vigilant. You have to watch what's going on. But the original question about whether or not there's any direct aid through the student loan provisions for people who don't ever leave, no, there isn't.
And there's nothing special for undocumented folks, undocumented students or dreamers who are studying that they can get extra aid or help in any other way.
No, there's nothing additional put in place for them. Whatever provisions and protections they had before COVID, they would have now, but there's nothing additional for them.
Mm-hmm. That's very disheartening, at the least.
Well, yes, given what's going on for those students in general, it's disheartening because they are more vulnerable.
Exactly. Yeah, and Patricia, do you want to speak to that in terms of how they're more vulnerable, or what are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about in terms of advocating for them?
Well, the dreamers, which are the students who are under protection by the Obama administration order to keep them in the United States. These are the children who were brought here when they were young and went through education in the United States. They are now uncertain about their immigration status. There is a case pending in the Supreme Court challenging the executive order that protects them and giving them immigration status, which is basically a permit to work and not a path to citizenship. That we still need to fix that part of our immigration policy for that group of students. But they are basically, in addition to living in the unknown, the not knowing what's going to happen to their status, they're also frontline workers. A lot of them are working, are just they're nurses. They're in the front lines. They're usually the ones that have a permit to work, so that they're providing for their parents who perhaps don't have immigration status, and they do not qualify for any relief at this point, federal relief as well. Even though they might be working with an ID, social security number. So, we have all these different categories of workers in this country, and to think that one life or one worker is more valuable than another worker in a time of a pandemic is sort of putting a value on people's life. And I know that some Republicans would like to say it's okay for some people to die, older people, to sacrifice themselves for younger people. I think that there is some underlying belief that if the majority of people who are suffering the brunt of the disease are people of color or immigrants, that perhaps they brought it upon themselves. But the bottom line is that we have all benefited from that type of labor, and we sort of have to think differently about how do we address the public health crisis of not protecting everyone who is in our society.
Mm-hmm. I agree completely. And I think this value judgment is, again, something that we need to reframe in terms of who we value and why. And I think this is part of why the income inequality is as high as it is. I think we have another question. Okay. So Mike in Glen Rock is asking, what kind of oversight is included in the COVID relief bills to make sure the money is actually going to help people? So I'd love for any and all of you to take that. And really, you know, I'd like to extend that question, if I may, in terms of accountability in general. You know, in the grants and the kinds of money that's going to corporations as well, and making sure that they're doing what they need to be doing. I feel like this is a big gap in some of the bills, and I think we've seen some of the stories that come out of it. But I'd love your perspective. So whoever wants to go in can jump on.
I'll respond quickly, and then everybody can jump. There is direct relief that we're asking for, directly money for people's paychecks, which, because we believe that if you give it to people directly, they'll use it for what they need. But $1,200 once in a while doesn't really cover all that the economics needs of the community. So there's requests to make it a payment of up to $2,000 for a certain amount of time, which will provide people some economic stability. That will go directly to taxpayers, just like the $1,200 that was already sent. Now, the other type of COVID relief that has been doled out directly to corporations, I think we need to improve the oversight process of who gets it, who qualifies. A corporation, like Amazon or even Target or of that sort shouldn't be getting a federal relief. And mid-sized corporations, they need to have some sort of things that we have to do. Perhaps pay higher wages, commit to a $15 per hour, commit to some type of sick leave, commit to some sort of agreement to respect workers' voices in the workplace, and commit to perhaps there is this movement to ask for health and safety workers committees on the workplaces, so that workers can have a voice in determining what's safety in the workplaces. So some sort of give back that secures that we are actually investing in corporations. And finally, I think small businesses, which are the hard core of Main Street or our communities, ought to also get more direct aid than corporations. That we should put a cap on what corporations are getting, and they should not be allowed to get money if they had consistently profits in the last two quarters of their earnings. Because if they're making money, they should not be getting taxpayer relief.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Patricia is spot on that. Like, she said it perfectly. So one of the things we actually don't have a great handle on right now is what businesses got PPP loans that aren't publicly traded. So the number of publicly traded companies is actually not that big compared to the overall number of loans that were given. And we know right here in New Jersey that non-publicly traded but politically connected companies lied on applications, like did all kinds of fraudulent stuff to get tax incentives. So we know this is what people do. They hire lawyers and they figure out loopholes. So we actually don't know. We can't even, as citizens, as residents, as concerned people, look at that list and see if these are companies that should be getting these loans. The other thing, and Patricia pointed this out, is like there's a difference between companies who are actually actively affected by COVID and ones that aren't. And we could, if we sat here for 5 minutes, we could form a list of companies that you would say, okay, obviously they're going to lose a lot of money with an economic shutdown. There's going to be a whole lot of companies that are doing just fine. even admit this terrible crisis, or whose bottom line won't be affected because, you know, maybe they are public contractors for insurance, or maybe they do, you know, road repairs or something in a state where that hasn't been eliminated. Like, those companies won't see as much of a hit on their bottom line. And so we really are putting our trust into the federal government to keep an eye on these companies. And frankly, like, knowing the cozy relationship that Washington has with large corporations, even those who are not publicly traded, family companies, private companies that are still major corporations, that makes me nervous. So I would just completely echo what Patricia said. We need better oversight, and these things cannot, every time there's a crisis or a perception of a crisis, we cannot just be giving blank checks to corporations. We've seen this movie before. It doesn't work, and we need to do better.
Yeah, I agree. Beverly?
That, you know, and in terms of distribution to small businesses, we saw what happened there. To administrate that through the banks, through private banks, was really a mistake. And, you know, in terms of providing direct aid to the states, you know, I think that's an area where the money should be funneled more through, for instance, in New Jersey, the EDA, there should be, you know, grants for CDFIs to get the money out the door to micro lenders. And again, we should start with the small businesses, the smallest businesses, and move up to the top. And as everyone has said, you know, it's funny when you look at legislation, whether it's in the state or there's always this debate about, you know, whether we want to have people, we require them to prove that they have hardship. You know, I think you could guess that most Main Street small businesses in states that have been shut down are going to have a hardship. Whereas was just pointed out, large corporations and businesses are much able to function, you know, they're able to function. That, you know, we see they turn a profit every quarter, and they, you know, they may not make their projections this quarter, but a lot of them are still going to make a lot of money. And so again, this notion of, you know, starting trickle down is not working. Getting the money to the states that know what's happening on the ground in their regions and know, you know, where the small businesses are, I think is what we have to fight for, because as Sue said, you know, we've been through this, we've seen this movie, it doesn't work. Bad ending. People are, you know, we know here in New Jersey that people are still struggling and getting back on their feet. I mean, it's just, it's not just embarrassing, it's demoralizing, it's depressing to think about people who still aren't back in their homes in Sandy, to think about people who still aren't back in homes after losing their homes in the housing crisis. So we know how that works. It doesn't work. You know,
I agree completely.
Bailouts through the banks doesn't work. You know, money to small businesses through large banks doesn't work. We need to bring the money to the state, get the money to the states. We want the money to come here directly to New Jersey, and move the money through the institutions that get to the smallest businesses and the people that are hurting the most, and get it to them fast. And anyway, the model has to change. It's not working the way it's being done now.
Yeah, and I think all three of you make really excellent points about where the money's getting, and, you know, where the fact that there is, and Sue, you made this highlighted the fact that we still can't know who it is and you know what they're doing with it. I will say that when I'm speaking with residents, when I'm speaking with constituents, especially with the heart and soul of Main Street in New Jersey, are the very small mom and pop stores, right? Very small stores, very small businesses who don't seem to be getting relief at all, either because have to jump through multiple hoops and barriers, and they don't have the wherewithal to get lawyers to help them understand what is going on with the application process in the first place, which was part of that. It was very opaque when it first came out, and it was hard to understand whether or not they were eligible, whether it was a loan, whether it was a grant, whether it was going to come, who you needed to talk to. And there was a circular, you know, go talk to this person, go talk to that person. But even beyond that, the definition of a small business and who got the money, as we found out, was really not what a layperson would think of as a small business at all. And really, you know, understanding that some of these businesses are, you know, more than 500-600 employees. I think 500 employees was the cutoff, was a different process. I will also say, and I'm going to, talk about payday lending. So we've been talking about payday lending for individuals and low-income folks in general. There's also, there was a move to open up some of the Fed programs for private equity firms, essentially what I call payday lending for small businesses in the name of liquidity, right? There was a move to try and advocate for that, as more, as something that definitely my opponent did, in terms of advocating for private equity firms to have access to part of these TAF loans, which frankly is money coming out of our pocket as taxpayers to give to firms that have millions of dollars in reserve cash. And again, to the point that you all were making about if there are corporations that have profit, that have enormous amounts of reserves of cash here, they should not be getting the relief packages, which are clearly made for folks who are hurting, who cannot make their next payroll, who cannot make rent, who cannot make mortgages, and who are really the backbone of the entrepreneurship that we're talking about in America, and not there to essentially profit in a predatory way, either with individuals or small businesses at the end of the day. And I think that's a really important part of the perspective that has been missing. And it's only now that we're talking about it a lot more.
And that's a role that Congress plays, to regulate how do we lend money or put money into the economy? Where do we focus the recovery? Does the economic recovery goes directly to small businesses and people, or does it go to corporate players? And that's a role that the Congress can play and regulate the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank, or how they lend and when. And so if the White House and the executive is failing to act, Congress has a responsibility to regulate how do they give this money out. So I think we need to hold Congress responsible. I think that the fact that we have the Congress in the hands of the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi is better than if we had it like we had in the hands of the Republicans. But at least that we need to do better as citizens to demand that Congress, and specifically an impacted state like New Jersey, demands a different economic model for how the government doles out debt. New Jersey cannot operate on debt because we have a balanced budget amendment by the federal government but debt is something that can be managed, and can be managed effectively to create economic activity that puts money on people's pockets. And that is a fundamental decision and a choice that our politicians need to make, that they will direct economic aid to create economic activity in our communities. And that means that we need to figure out how to push for more big projects. There's even proposals out there to create a job guarantee like we had in the 1930s, right? That we guarantee people a job through spending on big projects like the tunnel, like the Hudson Tunnel. They have failed to invest to create local jobs in construction that create jobs for small contractors in the construction industry. So there's things other than sending people money that Congress can spend on, so that they can create jobs directly in our local economies. And we need to drive the discussion towards that, not just towards more money for big businesses.
And I just want to add that in terms of consumer protections, one of the tragedies of our society now is that as a debt society, there's a huge industry that preys on people when they're down. And there's a tie-in when you were talking about small businesses. Well, when we were talking about small businesses that are not getting the aid that they need right away, and also the immigrant community. In that, I work in community reinvestment, and we struggle to get banks to provide loans to small businesses without asking them to use their personal collateral. So right now you have immigrants who are wonderful small business people who are, who have been the backbone and are making communities strong, who are now not able to work, not able to operate. They have debt. They have put up perhaps their own homes as collateral for these loans. And now they're going to possibly lose their home, lose their businesses, have to let their employees go, and lose their homes. And in that environment, we have, payday lenders who right there to knock on the door and say, I can give you that loan. It's going to cost you, it's going to be 400, 1200 APR, but I'm right here. And I think the Congress has an obligation to stop that and make sure that, small business owners, whether they're immigrants or not, have what they need until they can get back on their feet and get their businesses going. But I just would argue that we need to make, in addition to, I think what Patricia was alluding to, is being creative and looking at how we can build on, this is actually an opportunity to create jobs and to build the economy, make it stronger in the long run. If we invest in individuals to make sure their homes are stable, their finances are stable, invest in small businesses so that they can come back, employ people, keep goods and services moving. And we have an opportunity to build on our infrastructure, improve the environment, if we make the right investments. And we have the money, but instead of investing it where we've been talking about, we seem to think we need to put it in the hands of corporations that are already doing well and ask them to let it somehow move down to us. And so I like Patricia's note that we can build on. We need to be building in this situation. This is when we should be investing more in people, more in small business, and building this country.
I like that too, Patricia. Thank you for reframing it in that particular way. And I agree, Beverly, with what you were sharing as well, is that this is an opportunity, right? We have this horrific crisis that we're all going through that is showing us the kinds of things that are already bad in our society and really exacerbating them. But we have a choice. Right? We have a choice with how we react. We have a choice of saying, here's where we're going to allocate the resources with individuals and people and local governments, or whether or not we're going to allocate them with billionaires and big corporations that have a profit motive. And I think these are the decision points that we're in right now. And so agitating and making sure we're advocating for people at the end of the day is really the perspective with which we need to go through this. And I think we had a final slide for the last few minutes that we have left. This hour has flown by. Thank you all very much for your insight. And I think this kind of goes with it's an overarching question, but I'd love to hear on the building that we were talking about, that Beverly, you and Patricia were talking about, what measures you think were either neglected or not there in past bills that either should be included in the following bills, or really how should we, if I can restate this, how should we take advantage of this opportunity that we have, and how can all of us, what should we be advocating for? So either of the two questions, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'll just say quickly that I think we covered a lot of the holes that were there before. We need to make sure that people have consistent money coming in, not just, as Patricia said, I think every once in a while, but on a consistent basis, so that people aren't worried about their every bill. And I think it's interesting that we don't really think about how that trickles up. We don't ever talk about that. If a person is paying their rent, is buying groceries, is paying all their bills, is thinking about paying that living room, they are building the economy. They're making it stronger. All of the immigrants who've been locked out of the relief, those are hardworking people who pay taxes, many of them. We're just cutting off our noses to spite our faces. And these are integral parts of our society. So by not providing relief for everyone, again, we're cutting off our nose to spite our faces. And we need to, so the consistent, income relief, I think, is primary. We have to look at the big pockets of debt that people just can't sustain. Student debt, I would advocate for significant forgiveness. There's a lot of debate about how much, but certainly significant forgiveness in that area is an investment in our workforce and doing the kinds of things that Patricia is talking about, and enforcing laws that exist. The Borrower Protection Act, which makes sure that students who've been defrauded by predatory schools are refunded their money and don't have to pay those loans. Making sure that the Loan Forgiveness Act for students who are doing public service forgiveness act. That's not being implemented. That is an investment in our society and in our workforce. So there are things that needed to be going on before, but right now there should be a push to get those things done. Expanding paid leave, expanding family leave, protecting our health. Those are huge pieces that can come together in whatever we do to address this pandemic that do fix some of the past problems that we had, but particularly position people right now to survive, to keep their families healthy and safe, and then to move forward into better, stronger lives. And each of, I don't want to, Sue probably has some of the elements that we're missing, but I think the HEROES Act really does cover a lot of those things. I think we didn't talk about this specifically, but I think what has fallen short in a lot of the responses, both at the federal and state level, is not thinking through what's going to happen on day 91 or day 181 when things are lifted. Making sure that people don't have to pay 4 months worth of mortgages all at once, that people don't have to pay 4 months worth of student debt, student loan payments all at once. I think I would like to see a lot more care and thought put into what is going to happen when the state of emergency is lifted, and how people are going to manage all of the things that they have to deal with financially when that happens. But Sue, I'll leave it to you. There's probably some other things, and Patricia, that I've forgotten. But I think the HEROES Act goes a long way to addressing some of the stabilizing pieces that we all advocate for.
Thank you, Beverly.
Yeah, I mean, Beverly's put that beautifully. Patricia has hit some really key points. I think we've covered a lot about the bills. I would say that there's like some big picture thinking we have an opportunity to shoot for, not just with these specific relief bills, but with sort of how we structure our economy and our society around resilience and readiness, and what it means to be an interconnected and global society, and what it means to live in a democracy. And I think those questions can be really daunting, but also give us some hope for us getting this better next time around. So I think I'll leave it there.
Yes, I think that we have tried through our coalition, through the labor movement and social justice group and human rights group to address some of the concerns that we had on the previous Relief Act through the HEROES Act. Now we have to get it through the Senate, and I think we have to stay consistent on the message that we need a different type of relief. But overall, what we need is a shift on our priorities and on our economic model. We cannot continue just on a relief and bailout mode. We've been bailing out corporations every 10 years for the last 40 years. So we sort of, if it hasn't worked, what do we need to change? And I think that we need to bring that kind of big thinking that Sue is alluding to about how do we reshift the priorities of a society that go congruently with what a democracy ought to be, which is to secure opportunity and economic growth for everybody. So in that sense, those are like the long-term goals. But I think in the immediate also what we need to do is to secure people's health at work. And we're doing terrible in that. As we go into the summer and we're thinking about opening New Jersey, opening New York, and opening our economies, we still have a federal government that doesn't really believe that there is a role to play in creating guidelines that every employer has to meet. So Congress needs to get the ball rolling and provide some kind of mandates for OSHA to create guidelines, workplace occupational guidelines that they have to be enforcing at the minimum level, because even the business community, and I'm not talking about corporations that want to make all the rules, but the business community wants some consistency in occupational health hazards guidelines that they can follow, so that they can have the bottom, a minimum set of things that they can do that are consistent. So instead of Mitch McConnell talking about passing bills to get rid of liability, legal liability for companies, they ought to be thinking what are the minimum standards that we ought to be passing so that OSHA can do its job, how much more resources we need to put into OSHA regional offices so they can assist states like New Jersey and New York to protect people at the job. Because if we're not able to do that, we are gonna keep getting people are gonna keep getting sick at the workplaces and bringing it back to our community. So I think we need to also reshape this this conversation as to what's needed right now, and that's to secure worker safety in the workplace so that we can contain the public health crisis. And then how do we change the economy long term so that we can reprioritize our resources into helping people and strengthening our democracy.
No, I really appreciate that. I think that, I would add on to what you're talking about in terms of making sure that we're securing people's health by expanding healthcare coverage, by making sure we're advocating for paid sick and family leave. I think that's 100% something that we need to do moving forward. I would also say that, for my part, the Pandemic Anti-Monopoly Act is something that we need to move towards to protect real small businesses and make sure that we are going towards a consistent money that's coming in with that $2,000 monthly check, so that we are taking care, as you pointed out, Beverly, of a trickle up economy, right? So we are taking care of people. They don't have to fall prey necessarily to payday lending while we're securing that as well. And I think those things are going to be imperative moving forward. And to Sue's point about using this as an opportunity with big picture thinking, I think being able to think about jumpstarting that economy with a federal jobs guarantee, Patricia, as you were talking about, and really trying to think about how we can be more sustainable and really move towards clean and green jobs, as well as more resilient in the future by securing our social safety net. I think that's the only way we're going to be able to come out of this crisis with the perspective of helping the most amount of people that we possibly can and being resilient for the future. So I appreciate all of your perspectives. This has been really informative, I think, for me and I think for everyone else. So thank you so much, Sue, Beverly, and Patricia for being on. Really appreciate it. If there are any other questions, I'll share them with you as well. But this has been great. For those of you looking for resources, please, we have resources up here, Board of Social Services. Please send your stories to Beverly at njcitizanaction.org, as well as the Department of Labor. We also have resources on our campaign page as well for mutual aid for everyone who is involved in helping, would like to help, or need help for it. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And thank you for giving us your evening.